So welcome back, and this is Plato Gorgias part 2, which is not that it's actually broken up into two parts, it's just it's so much material that it's easier to break it into two videos for you. So if we remember from the last video, the key takeaway from the entire thing was obviously penguins. Obviously not penguins, pelicans. The key takeaway is not the penguins. Why have I put penguins there? Anyway, let's get past the penguins. Okay. So, let's seriously go back and just have a really quick run through to see if we can remember. So I'm jumping back through. Let's go. And let's do part 1 really quickly. So, Plato's Gorgias. It's a conversation between a group of sophists who are teachers. They are advocating rhetoric, which is the ability to manipulate people. Rhetoric doesn't care whether or not it is right or wrong. Socrates gets in an argument with Gorgias and then with Polus, and Polus is forced to admit that doing wrong is more contemptible than suffering wrong. That is the key phrase that starts off our part of the text. Callicles comes in, and Callicles wants to take issue with the fact that Polus has given this to Socrates, and says that Socrates is arguing from the point of view of convention, or the laws that people have, when the argument should start from the point of view of nature. His thought is that in nature, the strong shall dominate, and shall have more. For example, a lion and antelope, or the examples he uses are the figures of Hercules and Xerxes, which I've asked you to look up to understand who Xerxes is in particular. This leads to a long ad hominem attack on Socrates as a follower of philosophy. So it is an attack on philosophy, and the main thing to take away here is the distinction between rhetoric, which appeals to popular opinion, corporate, changing, temporal, and philosophy, concerned with truth, universal, unchanging, and eternal. So from the point of view of rhetoric, what is right or wrong changes according to the situation and to what the people would want, or what you might want to manipulate the people with. From the point of view of philosophy, what is right and wrong are eternally enshrined in the forms. Callicles says this, and Socrates immediately gets Callicles to start to redefine his terms. So Callicles accepts that superior, stronger, and better are synonymous. Socrates then says, according to nature, the general populace is stronger than an individual. The general populace make the laws. Therefore, superior is synonymous with better. Therefore, from the point of view of nature, the masses prescribe the laws is better. The masses are better than the individual. Therefore, the laws that they come up with, they subscribe, are more true, are better. The general populace rules that equal distribution of good is right, and that doing wrong is more contemptible than suffering. Hence, not only from the point of view of convention is doing wrong more contemptible than suffering wrong, but also from the point of view of nature, doing wrong is more contemptible than suffering wrong. Callicles redefines better as elite, so he rejects stronger, goes for the term elite. He then clarifies this and says elite means to be clever. Socrates dismisses the idea of clever, or not dismisses it, he gets Callicles to challenge what he means by clever by using the example of a doctor, a weaver, a shoemaker, a farmer. The idea being that someone who is clever in a particular field should have more than other people in that field, which is kind of an argument. What's the phrase? It is an argument towards the ridiculous. And there is actually a Latin phrase which I'll try and remember for you. It's just dropped out of my head. But basically, an argument towards absurdity, an argument ad absurdum. I think it's from memory. But you don't need to use Latin phrases, you just need to understand the idea. It is a deliberate argument to show that this idea, from this perspective, is absurd. Okay, that's the key. You don't need to just memorize Latin phrases. You need to understand what Socrates is doing. Socrates knows that his argument, the way he's approaching it, is slightly childish, so to speak, slightly absurd. That's what he's trying to show, that Callicles' position can be seen as absurd. This forces Callicles to redefine what he means by the elite and by clever, and he means specifically clever in politics, and such a person will be clever and have courage. So the thing that they will have more of will be more power, more ability to rule, more right to rule. More right is a better word than ability. That's great for Socrates, because now Socrates has got Callicles into the position where what he wants to... it's almost like he was working to this position all along. He's got Callicles to finally say that he believes that the better person, the superior person, is someone who is cleverer at politics, and politics is about ruling. This is where Socrates wanted to get Callicles, because it allows Socrates to now ask the next question. Should the people who rule be rulers, or should they be subjects? Obviously, Callicles is going to say they should be rulers. By this he means, are they in control of themselves, or is there something else controlling them? By ruling themselves, he means being self-disciplined and in control of oneself, mastering the pleasures and desires, which goes back, there is the key, mastering their own pleasures and their desires goes back to really what underpins Callicles' position, which is an attempt to come up with an excuse for a hedonistic lifestyle. Callicles rejects this idea by saying that human happiness is incompatible with enslavement to anyone. This leads Socrates to introduce a leaky jar analogy. He introduces first a leaky jar analogy which he had heard, which had to do with the mind and desires, and then he sort of takes this story that was around at the time and he uses it for his own purpose, comes up with his own leaky jar analogy, whereby you have two people, one who has self-discipline, their jars do not leak, they are able to fill up. One who has self-indulgence, represents self-indulgence, their jars have leaks, they are constantly needing to be filled up. This allows Socrates to say that such a people need to constantly be at work. Again, he is playing with Callicles' prejudices. Callicles doesn't want to work. So he's basically saying, oh, I get it. You want to be self-indulgent. You don't want to be imprisoned or enslaved to anyone else. So you, or the lifestyle that you say is a good lifestyle, is a lifestyle of forever filling up one's desires, which is a self-indulgent lifestyle, which is a lifestyle which will necessarily always have to be continuously working. And that work is required because you are not satisfied. So first of all, you have to always work, which Callicles won't like, and secondly, you will never be satisfied. So the self-indulgent lifestyle is not a good lifestyle because it is requires constant work and it requires never being satisfied. Whereas the self-disciplined lifestyle allows someone to reach a point where they are satisfied and they have that pleasure resides in the satisfaction. Callicles disagrees with this. Here we see that Callicles and Socrates are basically engaging in the same metaphor, but from different points of view. They're arguing from the different starting points. So for Callicles, the constant pouring in is the pleasure, not the water or the liquid that fills the jar. Okay, so being filled isn't pleasure, it is the act of being filled, which is the pleasure. This is how Callicles responds initially to Socrates. Socrates then says, well, if that's how you take pleasure, pleasure being constantly being filled, constantly needing to be filled, then basically the life you're describing is like a gully bird. And as we said, we don't know exactly what the gully bird was, but basically scholars have suggested the gully bird is a creature that either has food come in and immediately defecates it out, or like a pelican sieving up water in its bill, and then you see the water come out and the fish is left behind. But basically this idea, it would have looked like, to anyone looking at it in those days, a creature trying to take a drink, but the water constantly flows out. There was any of you who may have studied Greek mythology at any time will remember there's a couple of examples of people in Tartarus, in the Greek version of hell, which is a gross oversimplification of what I'm trying to get at, of the actual case, I should say. But basically, people like Syphilis, who is, from memory, is pushing the rock up the hill. And then if you look it up, you'll find that there's the other guy whose name just escapes me at the moment, who constantly wants to drink, and as he bends down, the water moves away from him. So he's in constant thirst. All right? Never able to satisfy his thirst. Those mythological images, stories, would have been in the minds of all the people in this discussion. So Socrates is, in a sense, appealing to that as well. That a life of pleasure, a life of self-indulgence, which constantly requires being constantly requires work, can never result in satisfaction. Therefore, can never be a pleasurable life or a good life. And that leads us back in. So that's a quick summary of everything we looked at in the last video. And for some reason, I typed penguins instead of pelicans, and that's why we've got penguins. But you got to admit, they do look pretty cool. Anyway. So, recall, key focus. An enjoyable life consists in keeping as much pouring in as possible. The gully bird question allows Socrates to ask Callicles if he means being thirsty and drinking when one's thirsty. So, you can sort of see Socrates, as he does, he goes, I don't quite understand. Let me see if I've got what you're saying right. You're obviously very smart. And I don't understand. Can you please explain it more for me? Do you mean by a good life being a life of self-indulgence, do you mean being thirsty and drinking when one is thirsty? Callicles says, yes, that's exactly what I mean. And of course he's gone straight to an appeal to one of the sort of base desires we have. We've mentioned our base desires are our desires associated with being alive and continuing the species. So it's drink, food, and sex. Given that Callicles is a hedonist in the sense of wanting to enjoy drink and food and sex in a way that gives pleasure. So let's put that focus not on sort of self on maintaining being alive or maintaining the species, but let's put the focus on drink, food, and sex on physical pleasure. Sort of keep a really sort of gross. When I use this word gross, I don't mean ugly or yucky, some of the ways it gets used now. I mean gross as in the sort of the most base way of looking at it. The most base way of looking at the hedonistic lifestyle is a lifestyle that aims at satisfying physical pleasures. So when we're talking about drink, we would be talking about alcohol, we'd be talking about getting drunk. We would be talking about the kind of euphoric high that comes from getting drunk or eating food, not just to maintain the bodily systems, but eating food for the sake of the taste, for the sake of an enjoyment that we would associate with terms like gluttony. So Callicles says, yes, he does. Being thirsty and drinking when one's thirsty. Yes, he does, says Callicles. Socrates then shifts this to having an itch and scratching him. I don't know if any of you have ever had a mozzie bite and you've had an itch and you've had that. You know you shouldn't scratch it because it's only going to cause it to get sore. But nevertheless, you scratch it. Or maybe you even push your fingernails into it and it hurts. But it hurts in a way that's kind of pleasurable. And you think, that's kind of, you probably don't think this is kind of nice. You just feel it's kind of nice, so you keep doing it. You keep scratching it. So, do you mean being thirsty and drinking when one's thirsty? Socrates says. Callicles then responds, yes. That's like having an itch and scratching it. Now, this allows Socrates to offer another example. And this example is he's deliberately starting to attack the lifestyle that Callicles is advocating. He uses the example of a catamite. Now, this can be translated as a male prostitute, although that translation is problematic. A catamite might be seen to be more like someone who... just wait one second. I'm just going to pause for a second and give you an actual definition because I think it's important. So I'm looking on my other computer, bright light. I mean, obviously you've probably done this much more. A boy kept for homosexual practices. Now, in ancient Greek, this is just from Wikipedia, bravo. In ancient Greek and Rome, a catamite was a pubescent boy who was the intimate companion of a young man, usually in a pederastic relationship, a sexual relationship. It was generally a term of affection and literally meant ganomein in Latin, but it was also used as a term of insult when directed towards a grown man. So there you go, that idea that it was used as an insult towards a grown man. Now, we have to be really careful of our own sensibilities here. Obviously, in our day and age, in our culture, the idea of an older or of an adult having a relationship with a young boy is offensive and, from our point of view, wrong. There was an element in ancient Greek and Roman society where this was, to a degree, regarded as a normal practice whereby the adult may give the young boy a better lifestyle and the young boy would reciprocate with sexual gratification. That's oversimplifying it, but it was also regarded, even in Socrates' time, it was regarded as, particularly for an older man, so the kind of people in this dialogue, including Gorgias, it would have been regarded as not really an appropriate thing anymore. Not necessarily because there was a bias against homosexuality, or because even there was a bias against a kind of older man, younger boy, pederastic, sort of pedophilic relationship, but more to the point because an older man wouldn't need that anymore. An older man who has come into their own no longer needs that sort of gratification. So, all of this is by way of saying that when Socrates offers this example, there's any number of examples. He could have said when you're hungry and you have to eat, but when you're itchy and you have to scratch. So then he says, it's like a catamite. Now, there's a whole bunch of insults going on here. So it's kind of like a catamite is when you need sex and you have to have the catamite. But given that he's just come off the back of talking about itching, everyone's mind would be thinking about sexual disease, and the fact that he's sort of suggesting, oh, this is like when you have a catamite. It is suggesting, if Callicles says yes, that's right, it's suggesting that Callicles advocates this lifestyle. This argument is designed to align Callicles with the life of a catamite, which is an insult to Callicles. And this is called a horn dilemma. Either he says a horn dilemma. So a horn dilemma is, you see, I'm creating horns. A horn. Either you choose this one or you choose this one, and either one that you choose, you're going to look bad or you're going to lose the argument. That's what a horn dilemma means. You can look that phrase up. It is a good phrase for you to have ownership of, to understand, to be able to use, to recognise in certain arguments. If two people are having an argument and someone puts forward as part of their argument a horn dilemma, then the other person cannot win that part of the argument. It's not like you're saying, so do you mean... It's not like you're trying to progress the argument, trying to progress the understanding of each side. So, more importantly, the example of a catamite allows Socrates to distinguish between good and bad pleasures. And that's actually that's his key, the next step. It always feels like Socrates is very conscious that when he says something, even when it seems to be either an insult or it seems to be an absurd comment, it's actually designed to go to the next part of his argument. And that's what's going on here. Socrates says, is it like having an itch and wanting to scratch it? Yes. Oh, that's like the life of a catamite. Which makes Callicles looks bad. And if Callicles says, yes, that's a good life, he looks bad. If he says, no, that's not a good life, that goes against his argument that it's like having an itch and scratching it. It then allows Socrates to go, oh, so being thirsty and drinking is a good pleasure, but being a catamite and requiring sex in this way, you're saying that's also going to be pleasurable, but it's a bad pleasure. Equally, having an itch and scratching it, most of us don't like getting bitten by a mozzie, don't like the feeling of having a sore that is itchy, but it gives pleasure to itch it. So the itching is a bad pleasure. Here is the key again, I'll say it slowly. This has now allowed Socrates to distinguish between the idea of good pleasures and bad pleasures. At this point, Socrates shifts what appears to be a new tact. He asks Callicles if he accepts that there is something called knowledge. This is a strange little bit in the conversation, because it feels like he's just got to this point where he goes, so you're saying there's good pleasure and there's bad pleasure. And effectively, Callicles is kind of by this stage going, I suppose that's what we have to think. Fine, says Socrates. Can I just ask you another question? Do you think there's something called knowledge? I don't know where this is going, says Callicles. But yeah, I believe there is something called knowledge. He believes that knowledge and courage are different. No, Socrates believes knowledge and courage are the same, but that's not said here. Callicles then, Socrates, I should say, recalls Callicles' definition of the superior person as clever at politics and brave. Pleasure, courage, and knowledge. Now, it appears like we've gone into some sort of different conversation. We haven't. In the back of Socrates' mind is the distinction of good pleasures and bad pleasures. Don't forget that Callicles has said that the good life is a life, he's effectively said the good life is a hedonistic life, a life of pleasure. The next part of the conversation involves a lot of back and forward between the two interlocutors, between the two speakers. Through a series of questions, Socrates gets Callicles to clarify his position, which can be summed up as following. 1. Pleasure is not the same as knowledge. 2. Pleasure is not the same as courage. 3. Pleasure is the same as good. That is now as simple a definition of hedonism as you can get. Pleasure is good. Point 3. Living well is the opposite of living badly. And again, you can imagine Callicles going, where are we going with this? But he just keeps following Socrates. Socrates here, this is, as I said, there's a lot of back and forward. There's a lot of back and forward because what Socrates is doing is he's really being quick to get a couple of definitions down that he wants to use. He's not giving Callicles any time to realise what's going on. Using the example of health and illness, Socrates gets Callicles to agree with the idea that opposites cannot exist in the same person at the same time. You cannot be healthy and ill at the same time. This is because they are, so to speak, absolutes. Now, there are degrees of health. So if you took a neutral person and then they were inflicted with an illness, obviously they can have degrees of how bad that illness is. But all of those degrees come under the term illness. So either they're healthy or they're ill. And there can be degrees of illness. There can be degrees of health. You might talk about someone who is healthy, they've got nothing wrong with them. You might talk about someone who's healthy and got nothing wrong with them. They go to the gym, they get a bit fitter. So maybe you might talk about them as being more healthy, but they are still healthy. It's just degrees of the one idea. But when you compare health and illness, you can't be healthy and ill at the same time. You're either healthy or you're ill. Now, it can be hard to keep track of where Socrates is going with all of this. So let's slow down a little bit and recall. Callicles has said that an enjoyable life consists in keeping as much pouring in as possible, and that this is like being thirsty and drinking when one is thirsty. Whenever you find a person losing and keeping things at the same time, then we'll know that they're not faced with the good and the bad. That's Socrates. So with thirsty and drinking to satisfy thirst, you have someone who is losing and keeping things. So the losing, if you talk about yourself as thirsty, you would say you have lost the satisfaction of being not thirsty. You're either thirsty or you're not thirsty. There can be degrees of thirsty, obviously, but you can't be thirsty and not thirsty at the same time. With this in mind, you'll start to see that Socrates is heading towards Callicles, getting Callicles in a position where he's forced to admit that pleasure and the good are the same. Are not the same. So Callicles says pleasure and the good are the same. And what Socrates is doing here, just keep in mind, Callicles is also saying that pleasure comes from being thirsty and then drinking when one is thirsty. Opposites. So this is called Socrates' opposites argument, and you may have a feeling that you understand at the moment, but you need to be able to articulate it and write it down. We can look at it this way. Premise 1, hunger is not pleasant. Hunger is unpleasant. Premise 2, satiation or satisfaction, of hunger is pleasant. Thirst is unpleasant. Drinking to satisfy thirst is pleasant. Thirst and drinking to satisfy thirst occur at the same time. They coincide. This is a really important point. Then we get to this. Pleasure is not good. It is impossible to live well and live badly at the same time. Now, Callicles has already admitted this. Pleasure and distress can coincide. They can happen at the same time. For example, thirst and drinking. So you've got your thirst, which is unpleasant. Then you've got the drinking, which is pleasant. And they are occurring at the same time. The satisfaction of thirst, i.e. drinking to satisfy thirst, cannot occur if you're not thirsty. Just because you're drinking, if you're not thirsty, you're not satisfying thirst. You're just tipping water into yourself or tipping liquid into yourself. For you to get the pleasure from satisfying that thirst, you need to feel the thirst. So pleasure and distress can coincide. Example, thirst and drinking. Hence, pleasure is not the same as living well, and distress is not the same as living badly. Okay? We've recognized that living well and living badly cannot occur at the same time. Pleasure and distress can occur at the same time. Therefore, pleasure is not living well, distress is not living badly. Therefore, pleasure and the good, don't forget that Callicles has already admitted that the good is the same as living well, are different. That is Socrates' opposites argument. So all that Socrates has been doing over the last part of the argument, which seemed to be all over the place, has been leading to this point. So now that you know this, you'll need to go back and have a look at the argument and sort of follow through. And then you need to be able to consolidate this in a way that you can explain it. These standard form versions of the argument are pretty simple. They probably do the job for you. In an exam, you could imagine getting a critically evaluate Socrates' opposites argument or outline Socrates' opposites argument. It's only going to be 3 or 4 marks. You could use this standard form of the argument to structure that. By this stage, you can imagine that Callicles is now becoming frustrated. Also keep in mind that Callicles said that the good life was a life of having more, and this came from being elite, and being elite in a particular field, which was the field of politics, and so you would be cleverer in politics and you would have courage. Socrates continues with another form of argument to get Callicles to admit that fools and cowards experience pleasure and intelligent people experience distress. So this is another form of the argument we've just seen. Let's follow it through. Fools and cowards experience pleasure. So, can a fool experience pleasure? This is as simple as just saying, Callicles, can fools experience pleasure? Have you ever seen a foolish person laughing, drinking, drunk, any of these things? Yes, obviously I have, says Callicles. Okay, can intelligent people, because you were saying that the good life resides in being cleverer, can intelligent people experience distress? Not only intelligent people, but heroes. So it's being cleverer in politics and also being courageous. So intelligent people, being cleverer, and heroes, courageous people, can they experience distress? And Callicles is forced to say, yes. Yes. He also goes as far as to sort of admit that for intelligent people, they're to a degree more likely to feel distress because they can understand the problems of the world. Again, this feels very relevant in today's day and age. If you were an intelligent, educated, particularly educated maybe in, say, humanities, in politics even, if you were an intelligent person, you could see how bad things are, in which case you're more likely to feel distressed. If you are, I'll give you another example. There's a huge debate at the moment about, well, there is debate, I won't say it's huge, there is debate about climate change. The people who feel most distressed about this, most concerned, most anxious about it, and angst leads to distress, or is distress, you'd probably say they are the people, like scientists who are intelligent, who understand what is happening. They are, and it is precisely their knowledge, their intelligence, which is causing them distress. Whereas, say, an average person in the street who doesn't really understand what's going on is less likely to be distressed by it. They're more likely to be manipulated by the rhetoric of their politicians. And if their politicians say, there's no problem, there is no such thing as climate change, because they're not intelligent in that field, climate change, they don't know anything about it, they were like, oh, well, that's not too bad. Or they might even go, okay, there is climate change, but, what can I do about it? Because they don't understand, or how will it affect me? There's a common argument to do with climate change from politicians, which is, yes, there may be climate change, but we cannot afford to dismantle elements of industry to lower, say, carbon emissions, because this will affect the economy. So we cannot affect the economy in the next 5 years because that will hurt people. I accept the climate change, but we don't want to hurt people by making them poorer. Now, the intelligent person says, yes, it will hurt us financially, but you need to balance being hurt financially with not existing, to which there is really no comparison. If the people who are worried about it costing them money in the future recognise that there will be no future, So sometimes they'll say, oh yeah, I accept climate change. I accept that it's probably going to destroy the Earth, but we can't do anything about it because it's going to cost us money in the future. Well, if the Earth's destroyed, there is no future. So having no money isn't going to matter at all. That's a very oversimplified sort of way of looking at climate change, but it aims to demonstrate that sometimes being more intelligent can actually be the cause of greater stress or distress. So pause on that and just go back. Fools and cowards experience pleasure. Intelligent people and heroes experience distress. Fools and cowards are bad. Callicles agrees with that. Intelligent people and heroes are good. Callicles agrees with that. Therefore, pleasure and good are not the same. Okay? We've recognized that fools and cowards can experience pleasure. Fools and cowards are bad. Intelligent people can experience distress. Intelligent people are good. So being good cannot be the same with not experience distress, i.e. pleasure. Pleasure and good are not the same. It's an oversimplification, but it suffices for this section. Callicles shifts from commending quality of pleasure to admitting qualitative differences between pleasure. So at this stage, Callicles has been forced to admit that, as we're saying, pleasure and good are not the same. They are not the same quality. So he shifts to admitting that there are qualitative differences between pleasures. Beneficial pleasures. So now he wants to basically get to the point of going, oh, I'm not talking about all pleasure. I'm talking about beneficial pleasures are good and harmful pleasures are bad. So a harmful pleasure would again be the example of scratching to satisfy an itch. It follows that good in some form should be the goal of pleasant activities rather than pleasure being the goal of good activities. This allows Socrates to return, we haven't seen this in our selection, but he spoke of it earlier in the dialogue, to the distinction between means and ends. Now this distinction between means and ends, we get it again with Aristotle. I'll just flag that for you so you can keep that in your mind. He argues that better pleasures are those whose longer term effects are good. This again highlights that pleasure is not the good because the good is something that pleasure can aim for. Okay? The good is something that pleasure can aim for. So the good is not pleasure. Pleasure aims towards the good. Which, again, this is supporting Socrates' position that the good is a final, singular, absolute, unchanging, and that beneficial pleasures can work towards it. So the question of how one is to distinguish between different pleasures leads Socrates to return to a distinction he had discussed earlier, not in our selection, between knacks and expertise. According to Socrates, knacks are to do with pleasure and expertise are concerned with the good. Socrates uses cookery as an example of a knack and medicine as an example of an expertise. It's a very quick little simple passage that doesn't seem to do much in the general scope of the text, but just to alert you, the whole text is being examined. And one year there was a question, 2 marks, what's the difference between a knack and an expertise? It wasn't really the sort of question that wanted to show an in-depth understanding of what Callicles' position on the good life was, or even what Socrates' position on the good life was. It was really just, do you know the text? And the trouble is, they can ask that question. Now, this is a huge text. Aristotle's a big text. There's a lot of texts to remember. When you enter the exam, there may be a question of this type. You will either know it, you'll remember it, go, yep, I remember that bit, and you'll be able to answer it because it'll be very simple. It's just being able to distinguish between two things or being able to define one thing. Or you may not remember it. You may go, I vaguely remember seeing that, but I haven't remembered it. It wasn't one of the key parts of everything I was trying to remember. If it happens, and it turns up, and it is the sort of thing that you don't remember, at most it's going to be 1 or 2 marks. The only advice I can give here, and this is more exam advice rather than specifically Plato advice, is if it happens, so be it, skip it, go. Get on to the questions you know, okay? It's in every subject. There's always that opportunity for something real obscure to pop up. Don't get hung up on it. If you sit there looking and going, oh no, I don't know this for 20 minutes and it's worth 1 mark, you're wasting time. There's only going to be 1, maybe 2 of these types of questions, if there are any at all. There have been exam papers I've seen where every question was based on the sort of fundamental parts of the different texts. They were obvious. That doesn't mean that everyone suddenly does well. It means everyone does better, which means that the really, really good students have to do even better to stand out. Okay. Anyway, Socrates uses cookery as an example of a knack and medicine as an example of an expertise. Knacks appeal to physical pleasure or pleasures of the mind, and appeal to the crowd or the masses. This allows Socrates to consider a whole range of practices. Playing the reed pipe is one example, which aim at gratification of the masses. And I'm certain as soon as you heard me start to say this, you were already going right back to the start of the text and going, wait a sec, he's going back to the distinction between rhetoric and philosophy. And that's exactly what he's doing here. This in turn allows Socrates to identify rhetoric as a knack or a form of flattery. Of course, this returns us to the beginning of the conversation. Rhetoric is aimed at the gratification of the fellow citizens and the common good, means less to them than their own private concerns. In contrast, speeches delivered by a good man, an expert, like a craftsman, someone who wants what's best for his audience, aren't aimless but have a purpose. This allows Socrates to proceed to identify the purpose, which is the key to having a good life. Socrates notes that any craftsman, painter, builder, shipwright aims to take the various components he works with and organize them into a particular structure. The same is true for other experts, such as trainers, doctors, who order and organize the body. The effect of organization and order on the body is called fitness or health or fitness. Socrates asked Callicles about the effect of order and organization on the mind. Remember earlier on when he pointed out that a ruler would have self-discipline and would be able to rule their desires, would be able to have mastery of their own desires, would be able to have control and be able to order. They wouldn't just, their mind wouldn't just go to whatever was the latest shiny thing in front of them. In other words, their mind wouldn't be driven by disorder. Also, it wouldn't be all over the place, is what I meant to say, which we might refer to as disorder. A ruler will have an organized mind, an ordered mind. Socrates says that the process that organization and mind, so the process that organize and order the mind is called law. That's how we organize the mind. And by extension, because the polis, the group of people, is a reflection of the individual, we have an organized mind, We have an organised polis, and we organise it with the law, which everyone fits into. It's not that one person's doing this and one person's doing this. We all agree and ordered according to the same order or convention. Because they make the mind law-abiding and orderly, which is to say they imbue the mind with justice and self-control. Because they, the laws or convention, make the mind orderly, which is to say they, the laws or convention, imbue the mind with justice and self-control, making people rulers of themselves, and the ultimate ruler of all of them will have this to the highest degree. So a mind in a good state is constantly aiming at self-control, goodness and justice. A mind in a bad state is ignorant, self-indulgent, immoral and irreligious. Self-control comes from discipline. So, says Socrates to Callicles, discipline is better for the mind than the indulgence you were recommending not long ago. By this stage, you can imagine that Callicles is feeling frustrated. He feels like his words have been turned around against him. He's pretty peed off. Socrates reviews the whole argument at this point. He stops. Socrates knows that he has travelled sort of a windy path. Okay, so he wants to just bring it all back so everyone understands what he has been saying. Pleasant is note, the same as good. How can I read these PowerPoints so many times and always pick up one or two mistakes? Please, I'm certain that when you take your own notes down here, your own knots down here, you will not... that you'll note that pleasant is not the same as good. Okay? If you like, I can fix that right now. So just wait 1 second. So, let's just escape that. We'll go back to this. You're watching this. Pleasant is not the same as good. Okay, Socrates reviews the whole argument. Pleasant is not the same as good. The good should be the reason to do pleasant things. The quality of pleasant makes us enjoy things. The quality of being good makes us good. To be good requires organisation and perfection. An orderly mind is a self-disciplined mind. A self-disciplined mind is a good mind. A self-indulgent mind is a bad mind. To further emphasize this, Socrates gives us a cosmic analogy. You just heard me say earlier that we have the individual, we have the polis. In most traditional thought, there is an idea of what we would call the microcosm and the macrocosm. The idea that the macrocosm, the universe, actually is an image of the microcosm. We sometimes get this shown in traditional images of which will draw the universe as if it is shaped like a man. It's not that they really thought that the planets and all that made up the shape of a man. It is that the universe is ordered according to the nature of man, and the nature of man is ordered according to the mind of the individual, and the mind of the individual is ordered according to the forms which are perfectly ordered in hierarchy. What that means for us is everything we've just said should have an analogy at the cosmic level. And it is easier to see things big than it is to see things small. So let's look at the cosmic analogy. According to Socrates, the expert's opinion is that cooperation, love, order, discipline, and justice bind heaven, earth, gods, and men. That's why they call the universe an ordered whole. Now, if you want to, and you're looking for criticisms here, obviously you have some basic criticisms that you can fall back on. Some of the ones we've seen ad hominem, whenever you attack the man, which is what Callicles did at the start. So in order to dismiss philosophy, Callicles attacked Socrates. He didn't actually attack philosophy, he attacked Socrates. You have things like the horn dilemma. So in order to win an argument, you don't go, here's the alternative. You give someone an alternative where there is no alternative. Either choice they make is going to mean they lose. You can make an appeal to the populace, which you would think that rhetoric effectively bases itself on this ad populum. The idea that everyone thinks this is right, therefore it's right. Another one is an appeal to expertise. Experts say this is right, therefore it's right. None of these, just because they are fallacies, doesn't mean that the argument is wrong or right. It just can be a way of assessing the argument. Obviously, an appeal to popularity doesn't mean it's right. And if you were to criticize the argument by saying that's just an appeal to popularity, doesn't mean the argument's wrong. But it does show that the argument itself is reliant upon this form, which is not necessarily right. So to start off by saying expert opinion is an appeal to expertise. And you might use that to criticize Socrates here. Nevertheless, basically most of the people there would agree with Socrates that cooperation, love, order, discipline and justice bind heaven and earth, the gods and men. That's why they call the universe an ordered whole. This comes from Hesiod, who was, along with Homer, one of the sort of early writers in Greek mythology / philosophy. Cosmos, the word cosmos literally means ordered. Chaos means disorder. The expert he is alluding to is Hesiod. This leads Socrates to conclude that happiness depends on having the attributes of justice and self-discipline, while unhappiness comes from immorality. All this returns us to the conclusion that doing wrong is more contemptible than suffering wrong. And that was the point that Polus conceded. That is the point that is built into the law of the convention, the law of the Polus, which Socrates, at the start of our argument, just before our part of the text starts, Polus has conceded that doing wrong is more contemptible than suffering wrong. So stealing something is worse than the suffering of not having the thing you want to steal. To go back to that example that we looked at. So this also confirms that to be a genuine rhetorician, i.e. to teach what is best for the people rather than just flatter them, a person would need to be a moral person and understand morality first. And that is the point that Gorgias had conceded. So earlier on, if we remember at the very start, Gorgias had conceded that he would teach rhetoric to someone who didn't know the difference between wrong or right, and when he admitted he would, he realised how bad that sounded, and so effectively he conceded that really you need to know the difference between wrong and right. You need to be a moral person before you know how to be able to influence people, because you will only get pleasure out of the influencing of people if you are ordering people. So you have to know what's wrong and right first before you can convince people of what is wrong and right, which will give you pleasure. or will be pleasant, might be, to distinguish that word pleasure as in the sort of physical satisfaction of pleasures from the idea of this is pleasant because it is good. And in fact, that's, if you're writing an essay, it is sometimes a helpful distinction to make, because the word pleasant and pleasure, they get used interchangeably, which is right and proper. But if you wanted to make this distinction, you could actually say, when I use the term pleasure, putting it in sort of scare marks, when I use the term pleasure, I mean the physical satisfaction of pleasures such as drink, food, and sex. When I use the word pleasant, I mean the sense of sort of satisfaction which arises from having done the good or achieved the good. Now that distinction again turns up in Aristotle. Okay, it's a really, so you could write it that way. So your examiner knows that when you're using the word pleasure, you mean one thing. When you're using the word pleasant, you mean another thing. That can be a helpful distinction to clarify for your examiner, for yourself, and then it allows you to distinguish things in your writing. I wouldn't be one bit surprised if that turns up as an exam question somewhere on the line. How does Socrates or Callicles and Aristotle understand the idea of pleasure? If that was 5 marks, there's actually a lot of clarification which would be required. Final words from Callicles. So by this stage, you can imagine, Callicles came into this conversation wanting to show off. He wanted to stick it up this guy Socrates. He also wanted to defend his group, the sophists, the people who believe in rhetoric. He wanted to defend them. Now, Gorgias had started off. Polus had come to Gorgias's aid. And now here was Callicles coming in to defend his elder statesmen, Gorgias and Polus. And he was going to show all of his friends at this party just how smart he was by taking apart Socrates. More to the point, he was going to show them how good at rhetoric he was. He was going to use rhetoric to beat philosophy. That was what he set out to do. And Socrates has taken him to a point where we have finally admitted that doing wrong is more contemptible than suffering wrong. Remember, that's Polus had admitted that to Socrates. Callicles was going to come in and try and show that was wrong, or that was a mistake. But now he's being forced to admit it himself. At this stage, all he says is, yeah, you're right, fine, who cares, whatever. He is, that phrase from our generation, whatever, kind of sums up where we end up with Callicles. Yeah, you're right, whatever. I'm smarter than you, but you just don't know it. He doesn't change his mind, which is an important point. How convincing is Socrates' argument? That's a typical exam question. Well, you would look through the arguments and you might be able to say that certain points of the arguments are quite convincing to you, the reader, but overall, the person he's trying to convince is Callicles, and Callicles isn't convinced. I'm not certain you could convince Callicles. Do you think he's actually changed his opinion? Does this show a limitation on the effectiveness of philosophy? Was Socrates really trying to change Callicles' opinion? Was he really talking to the rest of the group? Was he simply saying what he said, not because he was trying to change Callicles' opinion, i.e. engage in the act of rhetoric? Was he simply saying what he said because it was true? It was right. It was universally always right. He was going to repeat it no matter what. Remember that criticism that Callicles made of Socrates. You keep saying the same thing again and again and again. Yes, says Socrates, because it's true. I just say what is true. So maybe it's not a matter of being effective. Maybe Socrates wasn't trying to effectively change people's opinion, which is what rhetoric aims at. He was just saying it because it was the truth, which is sort of a good thing to keep in mind if you get that sort of word in an exam. How effective was this? How convincing was this? So you can both look at the arguments, look at the strength and the weakness of the arguments, look make a judgment on that in terms of convincing, but you can also note that maybe the issue here is Socrates is not trying to be effective or convincing. He is just saying it because it is true in accord with philosophy, whereas rhetoric is aimed at trying to be convincing. And that's the end. So you probably just got my face in a little black spot here, and I'll sort of fade out. I'm still here. Bye.